They said he had a heart made of ice, a man who spoke in commands, not conversations, a doctor who could save lives, but couldn't show love. Yet, she married him not because he was perfect, but because she believed every heart, even a cold one, has a story worth knowing. Pause, look at audience, but she never imagined that the man who once couldn't feel would one day teach her, and the world, what love truly means. He was known as the man with the frozen heart. In the hospital corridors, his footsteps echoed with precision, not warmth. His presence commanded silence, his gaze sliced through excuses before they were spoken. The nurses respected him, but they also feared him. Patients whispered about him, Dr. Adrian Frost, the surgeon who could save your life but wouldn't remember your name. His white coat was pristine, almost symbolic of the perfection he demanded from himself and everyone around him. To him, emotions were distractions, empathy was inefficiency, and kindness a luxury he could not afford. Every movement, every breath, every word from him was calculated. He was brilliant, but brilliance without compassion burns cold. No one ever dared to ask why he was that way. Some said he had lost someone once, a fiancé, a patient, no one really knew. Others said he was simply born heartless, gifted with a genius that left no room for gentleness. But what they didn't see was the quiet storm that brewed beneath his stillness. His life was a routine of precision, early mornings, surgeries that lasted hours, and evenings filled with medical journals. His home was as silent as his heart, spotless, emotionless, untouched. He had built walls so high that even light seemed hesitant to enter. To him, it wasn't loneliness, it was order. And order was the only thing that kept the chaos away. Then came her. Clara wasn't supposed to stay long, a new nurse, recently transferred from a smaller hospital, unshaken by hierarchy and unimpressed by his titles. She smiled too easily, spoke too gently, and carried an unexplainable warmth in her presence. Her laughter traveled down the halls like music in a place built for silence. Adrian noticed, though he would never admit it. The first time she greeted him, he didn't respond, he simply nodded and walked away. To him, politeness was unnecessary, efficiency mattered more. But she didn't stop. Every morning, she would greet him the same way, cheerful, genuine, relentless. He didn't realize it, but her consistency was already chipping away at his armor. The first time they clashed, it was over something trivial, a treatment plan. Adrian had ordered a strict post-surgery recovery procedure for a child who had undergone heart surgery. Clara, having spent time with the boy's mother, suggested a small adjustment that might make his recovery easier. He dismissed her suggestion without looking up from his chart. "We follow protocol, nurse," he said coldly, not feelings. But when she stood her ground, calmly explaining how the boy's anxiety could affect his healing, he found himself momentarily silent. Not because she was right, but because she dared to challenge him. Few people ever had. That night, for the first time in years, he thought about her words before falling asleep. Days turned into weeks, and their interactions became a pattern, a constant push and pull of ideals. She humanized every chart, every diagnosis, every statistic. He countered her compassion with logic, her softness with steel. But deep down, her presence unsettled him. It reminded him of everything he had buried, the warmth, the laughter, the vulnerability he had locked away years ago. There were moments he caught himself watching her, not with admiration, but with confusion. How could someone care so much without breaking? How could she smile at patients, even after watching them suffer? He began to question not her methods, but his own. One rainy evening, long after visiting hours were over, Adrian walked through the pediatric ward to check on his patients. The lights were dim. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. As he turned the corner, he saw Clara sitting beside a young patient's bed, reading him a story. The child's mother had dozed off in the corner, but Clara stayed, her voice soft and steady. The boy smiled in his sleep. For a moment, Adrian just stood there silent, unmoving. Something inside him shifted. He didn't understand it, and he didn't like it. But it was there, a crack in the ice, small but real. When Clara looked up and met his gaze, she didn't look startled. She just smiled, that same infuriating, gentle smile, and whispered, "He sleeps better when he knows someone's here." Adrian didn't reply. He turned away and walked off, but that image stayed with him all night. In the days that followed, Adrian found himself noticing things he used to overlook. The trembling hands of a nervous intern, The exhaustion on a nurse's face after a double shift, the fear in a patient's eyes right before surgery. He had always seen these things but never felt them. Now he couldn't ignore them. And though he told himself it was meaningless, he began to linger a little longer after rounds, sometimes watching Clara speak softly to patients, sometimes listening from a distance. It wasn't affection, not yet. Curiosity, the kind that comes when someone begins to remember what it means to be human. And for Dr. Adrian Frost, that realization was both terrifying and inevitable. For a while, Adrian tried to pretend that nothing had changed. He told himself that his sudden awareness of Clara's presence was nothing more than distraction and unnecessary disturbance in the precise rhythm of his life. But the truth was far more complicated. Her energy, her warmth, her way of turning chaos into calm, it all began to challenge the rigid system he had lived by for years. Every time she entered the room, the air seemed to shift, to soften. She spoke to patients with a tenderness he could never imitate. It was infuriating to him how she could be so calm, so gentle, and yet so effective. He had spent years perfecting his craft through discipline, calculation, and control, yet somehow this woman achieved the same results, sometimes even better, with nothing more than kindness. It wasn't long before their differences spilled into open conflict. The tension between them became palpable, like static before a storm. It started with little things. She questioned his tone when he snapped at the nurse. She reminded him to say please when giving orders. She even rearranged the patient charts on his desk to make them more human. That last one nearly pushed him over the edge. "This is a hospital, not a charity house," he told her sharply, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "We're here to treat patients, not coddle them." Clara didn't flinch. She met his glare with calm defiance. "Maybe if we treated them like people instead of problems," she said quietly, "they'd heal faster." Her words hit harder than he expected, but he didn't respond. He simply turned away, pretending not to hear the truth in them. The clash between them became a silent war: logic versus empathy, precision versus patience, coldness versus compassion. Their colleagues began to notice. Some whispered that the two of them were bound to destroy each other. Others believed Clara was the only one capable of thawing his heart. The hospital staff watched them the way people watch a spark near dry wood, knowing that sooner or later something would catch fire. Their arguments, though professional on the surface, carried a strange intensity beneath. It wasn't hatred, it was passion, clashing in its rawest form. Adrian hated that she made him feel. She hated that he refused to, and yet neither of them could avoid the other. Their paths kept crossing in the corridors, during surgeries, in staff meetings, like fate itself refused to let them stay apart. One afternoon, after a particularly long surgery, Clara found him sitting alone in the break room, staring at a cup of untouched coffee. It was unusual. Dr. Frost was never seen resting, never seen still. She approached cautiously, unsure if she should say anything. "You did well today," she offered, her tone gentle. He didn't look up. "Doing well is my job," he replied, his voice flat. She smiled faintly. "You say that like it's the only thing that matters." He glanced up then, his eyes sharp but tired. "It is the only thing that matters," he said. "You get too close, you care too much, and one day you lose someone. Then caring becomes your weakness." His words hung in the air like a confession disguised as logic. For the first time, she saw not arrogance but pain. Quiet, buried pain. "Or," she said softly, "it becomes your strength." She didn't wait for him to reply. She just walked away, leaving him with a truth he couldn't escape. That night, Adrian couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in his mind long after he had turned off the lights. Caring becomes your strength. He didn't want to admit it, but he was tired of being strong, tired of being untouchable, tired of pretending that perfection was enough. For years he had convinced himself that detachment was discipline, that emotions clouded judgment. But Clara's presence had begun to dismantle that belief piece by piece. He found himself noticing the world differently, the small, human things he used to overlook. The sound of laughter echoing through the ward, the gratitude in a patient's eyes, even the way Clara brushed a strand of hair from her face as she worked, focused yet gentle, determined yet kind. These were things he used to find irrelevant. Now they haunted him. The real clash, however, wasn't between him and Clara, it was within himself. The doctor he had become and the man he had buried were finally at war. She was a mirror he didn't want to face, because in her reflection, he saw everything he had lost: compassion, vulnerability, and the simple act of caring without fear. And yet, beneath his frustration was something dangerous: admiration. He admired her courage to care, her strength to stay soft in a world that rewarded hardness. He would never say it aloud, but deep down he knew she was winning this battle not by force, but by persistence. Every word she spoke, every act of kindness she showed, was a quiet rebellion against the cold world he had built. And though he didn't realize it yet, she was slowly rewriting the rules he had lived by all his life. It happened quietly, not in a grand moment of revelation, but in the smallest, most unnoticeable ways. The man who once walked through hospital halls with unflinching focus began to hesitate. He still wore the same crisp white coat, still commanded the same respect, but something beneath the surface had started to change. He found himself lingering after rounds, listening to conversations he used to tune out. When Clara laughed with the nurses, he would glance in her direction without meaning to. When patients thanked him, he no longer brushed it off with cold efficiency. He nodded, sometimes even allowed himself a faint smile. These were subtle shifts, invisible to most, but to him, they felt like cracks in armor he had spent years perfecting. One evening, a young boy was brought into the emergency room, a car accident victim, barely clinging to life. Adrian led the surgery, his hands moving with the same mechanical precision that had made him a legend. For 6 hours, the operating room was silent except for the steady rhythm of machines and the muted sound of his voice giving instructions. But when the child's heart stopped and refused to restart despite all efforts, something inside Adrian faltered. He had lost patience before countless times, but this time, when he removed his gloves, his fingers trembled. Clara, who had assisted him throughout, noticed. She didn't speak. She just stood beside him as he stared at the still form of the boy, the air around him heavy with unspoken grief. Afterward, he sat alone in his office, the weight of failure pressing against his chest. For years, he had taught himself to detach, to move on to the next case without looking back. But this time, he couldn't. He kept seeing the boy's face, hearing the faint echo of his mother's cries outside the operating room. It wouldn't leave him. When Clara knocked softly on the door, and entered, he didn't tell her to go away. She didn't say anything either. She simply sat across from him, her presence calm and steady. Minutes passed in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't demand words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I did everything right." She nodded. "I know." He looked up, frustration clouding his eyes. Then why wasn't it enough? Clara's gaze softened, because sometimes doing everything right isn't the same as doing everything possible. That night, Adrian didn't sleep. He walked the hospital halls until dawn, haunted by a feeling he couldn't name. The next morning, he surprised everyone, including himself, when he went to check on the boy's mother. It was something he never did. Once a case was over, he moved on. But this time he couldn't. The woman was sitting quietly in the waiting area, her eyes swollen from crying. When she saw him, she stood up uncertainly, unsure of what to say. Adrian hesitated, words catching in his throat. For a moment, he almost turned away, the instinct to retreat still strong, but Clara's voice echoed in his memory, doing everything possible. So he stayed. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. The woman didn't respond at first. Then she whispered, "Thank you for trying." That simple sentence undid him more than any accusation could have. For the first time in years, he felt something raw and real: grief, humility, humanity. From that day, people began to notice a subtle shift in him. He started spending a few extra minutes with each patient, asking how they felt instead of just how they were healing. He spoke less sharply to his colleagues. He even learned to say thank you. It wasn't that he had suddenly become warm or friendly, far from it. The ice around his heart hadn't melted completely, but the cracks were there now, visible and irreversible. He still wore his composure like armor, but sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Clara would catch him looking out the window of the staff lounge, lost in thought. He seemed almost human, but change rarely comes without resistance. There were days he hated himself for softening, days when he tried to rebuild the walls she had unknowingly broken. He told himself it was weakness, that empathy would only make him vulnerable again. Yet, every time he tried to return to the man he had been, something stopped him: the memory of a boy's heartbeat, the gratitude in Adrian's mother's eyes, and the quiet strength in Clara's presence. He began to realize that maybe vulnerability wasn't his enemy. Maybe it was the part of him he had been afraid to face all along. And though he would never admit it out loud, he knew exactly who had started this quiet transformation. It wasn't time, it wasn't loss. It was her, the woman who smiled when he frowned, who stayed when everyone else kept their distance, who believed that even the coldest heart could feel again. The cracks in his walls weren't signs of weakness anymore. They were proof that light was finally getting in. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning, the kind that began with the hum of machines, the smell of disinfectant, and the quiet rhythm of hospital life. Adrian was reviewing patient charts in his office when the knock came. One of the nurses entered, her expression unusually tense. "It's Nurse Clara," she said, hesitating. "She fainted during rounds." For a second, the words didn't register. He blinked, setting down his pen. "What do you mean, fainted?" The nurse swallowed hard. "She's being taken to the emergency ward. It seems serious." Adrian was on his feet before she could finish. He didn't remember leaving his office, didn't remember the corridors or the elevators, just the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he ran. When he reached the emergency ward, Clara was lying pale and unconscious on the bed. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow. The sight hit him with a force he hadn't expected. The room was full of medical staff, doctors, nurses, even interns, but for the first time in his life, Adrian wasn't thinking like a doctor. He wasn't analyzing symptoms, wasn't calculating possibilities. He was thinking like a man terrified of losing something, someone he didn't know he couldn't live without. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his effort to keep it steady. "We think it's an infection," one of the doctors replied. "We're still running tests." Adrian's hands curled into fists. Infection. The word felt like an accusation. He wanted to take control, to order everyone out and handle it himself. But for the first time, his hands didn't feel steady enough. He stayed by her side as they worked. The minutes stretched like hours. Machines beeped, voices murmured, and every sound felt painfully distant. He watched her chest rise and fall, too shallow, too slow. The woman who had filled every corner of his world with warmth now lay fragile and still, and it broke something inside him. When they finally stabilized her, relief washed over him, sharp and heavy. But the fear didn't leave. He sat beside her bed long after everyone else had gone, his usual composure gone entirely. He looked at her, the faint curve of her lips, the soft lines around her eyes, the way her hair fell across her forehead, and for the first time in years he prayed. Not as a doctor, not as a man of logic, but as someone desperate for a miracle. Hours turned into days. Clara remained unconscious, fighting a high fever and a spreading infection. Adrian barely left the ward. The staff whispered about it. Dr. Frost, the untouchable, sitting for hours beside a nurse's bed. But he didn't care. He refused to leave her side. He monitored her vitals himself, adjusted her medications, read her chart again and again, even when there was nothing new to read. Sometimes he just sat in silence, watching her, remembering every word she had ever said to him, her laughter, her challenges, her quiet wisdom. He thought about the countless times she had stayed late to comfort a patient, the way she always found light in the darkest rooms. And he realized something that terrified him more than her illness ever could. He had spent his entire life saving lives, yet the only one that truly mattered to him now was slipping through his fingers. Late one night, when the ward was quiet and the world outside the windows had gone still, he reached for her hand. It was small and cold, but he held it as if his touch alone could bring her back. His voice broke as he whispered, "You can't leave now. not when I just started to understand. It wasn't the kind of confession found in stories or poetry. It was raw, simple, and real. For years, he had hidden behind walls of perfection and arrogance, but now, stripped of all that, he was just a man who had forgotten how to feel and was terrified that he'd learned too late. A single tear slid down his cheek, catching him off guard. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral, since the day he decided emotions were a weakness. But now they were all he had left. When Clara finally woke, weak but conscious, he was still there. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, confusion crossed her face. Then she saw him, and a small, tired smile appeared. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You faint for one day," he said softly, "and I forget how to breathe." It wasn't meant to be romantic, but in that moment it was everything. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore, it was warm, alive, filled with all the words neither of them needed to say. And as he sat there, holding her hand, he realized that this not success, not control, not perfection was what it truly meant to be alive. That night changed everything. For Adrian, it wasn't just about love, it was revelation. He understood now that compassion wasn't weakness, that caring didn't make him fragile. It made him human. The walls he had built over the years didn't crumble all at once, but they no longer felt unbreakable. He began to see medicine not as a science alone, but as a bridge between hearts. The cold, arrogant doctor everyone had known was gone, and in his place was a man rediscovering the world, one heartbeat at a time. The change didn't happen overnight. Healing never does not for the body, and certainly not for the heart. After Clara's recovery, Adrian found himself looking at the world differently. The hospital that had once felt like a battlefield now seemed more like a living organism full of people, emotions, and fragile hopes. He began to notice the things he'd ignored for years. The way sunlight filtered through the ICU windows in the morning, the way laughter echoed faintly from the pediatric wing, the way gratitude softened the faces of families in waiting rooms. These weren't just background noises anymore. They were signs of life, reminders that medicine wasn't only about survival, it was about connection. Colleagues started to notice first. The once feared doctor. Frost no longer barked orders down the hallway. He listened now, really listened when his team spoke. He asked for opinions, thanked the nurses, and even checked in on interns who looked overwhelmed. It was subtle at first, but the atmosphere around him began to shift. The air that used to freeze when he entered a room now carried something warmer, something human. Of course, people whispered about it. Some said love had changed him. Others joked that he'd been replaced by a doppelganger. Adrian didn't care. For the first time, he didn't need to defend himself. Let them talk. The truth was simple. He had spent years saving lives but had only just learned what it meant to live one. Clara returned to work after a few weeks, and though she looked a little paler, her spirit was untouched, radiant as ever. The first time she saw him back in surgery, she smiled behind her mask, sensing the difference before anyone else did. He was still the same brilliant surgeon, still precise and commanding. But now there was something gentler in the way he spoke to his team. Something more reassuring in his tone. When a young nurse fumbled a surgical tool, Adrian didn't scold her. Instead, he took a breath and said calmly, "It's all right. Try again." The staff exchanged stunned glances. Doctor, Frost patient, understanding. It felt like a miracle, but Clara wasn't surprised. She knew this wasn't a sudden miracle. It was the quiet bloom of change that had been growing in him for months, nurtured by the very emotions he once denied. Outside the operating room, he changed in other ways too. He began volunteering time in the children's ward, something he'd once considered a waste of hours. The first day, he read a story to a little boy recovering from heart surgery. His voice caught halfway through. The boy laughed and said, "You're not very good at this, Doc." Adrian actually chuckled and replied, "Guess I'll have to practice." It was a small moment, but it echoed through the halls. Patients who once feared him now smiled when he entered the room. Families greeted him with warmth instead of wariness. He had become something no one thought he could be: approachable, human, but transformation is never without pain. Adrian began to confront the ghosts he had buried long ago. Late at night, he would sit in his office and think about the young man he once was, the one who had lost someone he loved during his early career. Back then, he had blamed himself, convinced that emotions had made him weak, that if he'd been colder, more detached, he might have saved her. That guilt had driven him for years, turning compassion into fear. Now, with Clara's hand sometimes resting gently on his, he understood that love hadn't made him fail, it had only made him human. And being human wasn't the flaw he thought it was. It was the very thing that gave his work meaning. Slowly, his reputation evolved. Patients began requesting him not just for his skill, but for his kindness. He started speaking at conferences not about surgical techniques or innovations, but about empathy in medicine. His lectures became famous for one simple message: a doctor's greatest tool is not his scalpel, but his heart. Those words carried weight because they came from a man who had lived both extremes: the cold precision of detachment and the warm imperfection of compassion. And every time he stood before a crowd, he saw Clara sitting in the front row, smiling softly, the living proof of everything he'd learned. There was still a quiet arrogance about him, not the cruel kind, but the kind that came from confidence tempered with humility. He was still Dr. Adrian Frost, still brilliant, still relentless. But the difference now was that his strength didn't come from control. It came from connection. The walls that once defined him had become windows, clear, open, letting others in. And though he would never admit it aloud, he knew that every bit of goodness in him, every ounce of humanity he had rediscovered, had begun with her. The nurse who refused to bow to his coldness, the woman who saw the man beneath the mask, the light that had found its way through the cracks. In the years that followed, the story of Dr. Adrian Frost became something of a legend within the hospital. New interns whispered about him the way people speak of myths: the surgeon who used to be made of ice, whose heart had thawed in the presence of a single nurse's warmth. They never saw the cold, distant man he once was. They only saw the version Clara had helped uncover: patient, kind, quietly wise. Yet, beneath the legend was something much more human and far more fragile. Adrian knew that transformation was not a destination but a daily choice. Every morning when he put on his white coat, he reminded himself to be gentle, to listen, to feel. And sometimes, when the old habits crept in, the impatience, the need for control, he would think of Clara's smile, and the storm inside him would quiet again. What Clara had taught him, without ever intending to, was that coldness is not always cruelty. Sometimes it's protection armor built by people who have been hurt too deeply, who have loved and lost, who have seen too much pain to risk feeling again. For years, Adrian had mistaken his armor for strength. But strength, he learned, was not the ability to feel nothing, it was the courage to feel everything, and keep going anyway. The arrogance that once defined him wasn't pride in his skill. It was fear of his own fragility. Clara hadn't broken him down. She had simply shown him that even the strongest hearts need a place to rest. Her compassion had not demanded his change, it had inspired it, quietly, persistently, like sunlight softening ice. Sometimes, when they walked through the hospital together, Clara would laugh at how patients lit up when they saw him. "You're not as scary as you used to be." She'd tease. He'd smirk and reply, "Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to maintain." But inside, he felt something deeper than humor: gratitude. Gratitude for the woman who never gave up on him, for the lessons she had taught him without ever preaching, and for the life he had almost missed out on because he was too afraid to feel. He often wondered how different things might have been if she hadn't come into his life when she did. Would he still be that lonely man in a spotless office, mistaking silence for peace? The thought alone made him shiver. Over time, Adrian began mentoring younger doctors not just in surgery, but in empathy. He encouraged them to sit with their patients, to listen to their fears, to see the person beneath the diagnosis. Medicine is not only about saving lives, he would say, it's about touching them. His words carried a weight born from experience, from loss, from love. The young doctors admired him not just for his brilliance, but for his humanity. They said he had a way of looking at people that made them feel seen, something rare in a world that often reduced suffering to statistics. Adrian never told them that he had learned that look from Clara from watching the way she treated every patient as if they were the only one in the room. And yet, even with all the changes, Adrian remained humbled by one truth. Compassion doesn't make you invincible, it makes you real. There were still nights when he lost patience, still moments when grief struck hard. But he no longer ran from it. He allowed himself to mourn, to feel, to remember that love and loss are two sides of the same human experience. Clara often found him sitting in the quiet of his office after a difficult day, staring out the window. She never interrupted him. She'd simply place a hand on his shoulder, and that was enough. He'd smile faintly and whisper, "You were right. Caring is strength." And she would reply, as she always had, "It always was." Their story wasn't one of perfection or fairy tale endings. It was one of redemption. A story that proved that people can change, not because they're forced to, but because someone believes they can. Adrian's journey from cold arrogance to quiet compassion wasn't about romance alone. It was about rediscovering humanity, his own and others. It was about realizing that sometimes the people who seem hardest to love are the ones who need love the most. The lesson he carried, and the one he left for everyone who knew him, was simple yet powerful. You never know what someone has survived to become who they are, and sometimes all it takes is a little kindness to help them find their way back. Years later, when people spoke of Dr. Adrian Frost, they no longer called him the coldest doctor in the hospital. They called him the doctor with the warmest heart. The transformation was complete, but it had never been about changing who he was. It was about uncovering who he had always been beneath the fear, the perfection, and the pain. Clara often teased him that she'd married a storm and turned it into spring. He would smile that rare, gentle smile that once seemed impossible and reply, "No, you didn't change me. You just reminded me I was human." And she knew that was true, because love doesn't always arrive with fireworks and grand gestures. Sometimes it comes softly through patience, through understanding, through the quiet courage to stay when it's easier to walk away. The man who once believed that emotions made him weak now understood that they were the very thing that gave him strength. He learned that saving lives wasn't only about skill, it was about heart. That healing didn't end with a successful operation, it began with compassion. And that arrogance was only ever a mask for fear. Their love story wasn't perfect, it was real. It was built on silence, struggle, and slow transformation. And in that imperfect journey, they discovered something profound, that even the coldest hearts can learn to feel again when touched by genuine kindness. So, when people asked Clara what it was like marrying the coldest and most arrogant doctor, she would smile softly and say, "He was cold, yes, but even ice, when it meets warmth, doesn't disappear, it becomes water, and water gives life." And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all, that no heart is too frozen to thaw, no soul too lost to find its way back, and no love too simple to change a life forever.